More evidence of the growing wealth gap in the United States. A new report says that the number of people living in poverty could be at its highest level in nearly half a century. How can the U.S. government help its least fortunate? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. In 2010, 1 in 6 Americans were considered poor. That's more than 47 million people living on less than $10,500 per year. The official government numbers on poverty in 2011 will be released just weeks ahead of the November presidential elections. But an Associated Press survey of economists and think tanks says that the number of poor Americans could reach 15.7%, making it the highest level since the 1960s. The United States already has more poor people than any other developed country. Analysts say it will be years before the U.S. starts to see poverty drop below the rate it was before the so-called 2008 Great Recession. And on Friday, more bad news. The U.S. government announced that the economy grew at an annual rate of just 1.5% in the second quarter. The economy is by far the most important issue for the November presidential elections. But do either President Barack Obama or his presumptive opponent, Republican Mitt Romney, have any real plans to help America's least fortunate? That's the question I asked Dr. Cornel West, Professor Emeritus at Princeton University and co-author of the book The Rich and the Rest of Us, A Poverty Manifesto.
I've seen very little evidence among the politicians. I've seen much evidence among the journalists, and that's very important. Tavis Smiley and I went on a poverty tour last summer. 27 TV shows, Rich and the Rest of Us, The Poverty Manifesto, #7 New York Times bestseller list. Lo and behold, a conversation was reinforced, and it did take off. The question will be, will the journalists challenge the politicians? The politicians will remain stuck on the middle class because poor people, for the most part, don't vote in their mind. And second, both are tied to oligarchic rule, both are tied to Wall Street. And Wall Street, of course, has a classic indifference when it comes to most poor people.
You know, just on that point you mentioned that we see so much, for want of a better word, greed, avarice. Just look at the salaries in Wall Street, as you mentioned, or the salaries that top executives command. Child poverty in the United States is at 22%. Has this country lost its heart?
Well, no, I think that it's true that we Americans should be ashamed when we look at the level of poverty among our fellow citizens, no matter what color, no matter what culture or sexual orientation or religion or non-religion. But poverty's always been high in America. In 1959, it was 22%. 1939, 1 out of 2 Americans were poor. Now it's 1 out of 6, and now it's 150 million living in poverty or near poverty. Now, that means not that we've lost our soul. It means that we want to be able to do something about it, but our political system is so broken that the will of the people cannot filter through. It's dominated by big money, big banks, and big corporations who have their way. So I don't give up on the American people. I just abhor the sleepwalking among the American people, and I abhor the greed among so many people at the top.
You know, the United States calls itself the richest country in the world, yet it has a poverty rate, according to census figures, that is close to 16%. Many people live every day from hand to mouth. What's gone wrong?
Well, it's just vast wealth inequality, that we have a system with oligarchs at the top who are able to gain access to billions and billions of dollars with no public accountability, no contribution to public life or common good whatsoever, and they dominate the political system, and so the will of the people can be suffocated at the bottom, and the cultural decay is reinforced, the self-medication, the addiction, the escape, the forms of trying to deal with pain that don't take the form of political organization or mobilization, but take the form of escape through forms of sexual and alcoholic addiction and so forth. And so we're in a very important turning point in the history of the American empire at this point, no doubt.
What do you make of those, mainly on the right, who say that the safety net has worked up to a point, but enough is enough? Those who are poor are not really poor. They drive cars, they live in homes, they perhaps watch television at home.
Now, I would invite the right-wing American brothers and sisters to spend a week on the road interacting with precious poor people of all colors. Because what they do is they have the Heritage Foundation studies and other studies at ivory towers that try to come up with forms of rationalization that reinforce the indifference and sometimes even contempt toward poor people. But my hunch is if they were to burst their bubbles and actually spend some serious time in the ghettos, in the hoods, with poor whites in Appalachia, on the Indian reservations, on the brown barrios, they'd have a very different view of what's really going on the ground in America. And this is what I think is very important to keep in mind. America is rich, America is wealthy, America is powerful. America will never be a great nation as long as America allows for high levels of poverty, because greatness is not measured in terms of might and force, it's measured in terms of justice and compassion for the weak and vulnerable.
So, is there the political will to improve the lives of America's poor? To discuss this, we're joined by U.S. presidential candidate Rocky Anderson and by Barbara Ehrenreich, author of the book Nickel and Dimed. We also have Stan Veuger. He's an economist and research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Well, we heard those figures there. We expect the poverty level, and that was calculated in 2011, to be 15.7%. That amounts to just almost 50 million people in the United States. This in a country which likes to call itself the world's richest country, which spends more on defense than the rest of the world combined. Barbara, where has this all gone wrong for the United States? Why is this poverty level rising so fast?
Well, I want to put the emphasis on something Cornell did not stress, and that is that we are creating poverty in this country. I mean, not we personally around this table, but when so many employers pay wages that are insufficient to live on, below a living wage, when there are so many traps for poor people. If you are relatively poor, you're going to pay much higher interest for anything you want to buy, a car, anything. You're going to be ripped off in every direction. Right. If you are unemployed, employers are not going to want to hire you because you are unemployed. If your credit rating is bad, nobody's going to want to hire you. It's like we have a system for pushing people who begin to slide down further and further.
Right, and when you talk about low wages, those are for people who already have jobs, right?
Yes.
Stan, to what do you attribute the rise in poverty?
It's unclear it's risen, right? I think it's gone down over the past century quite significantly, actually. I think Professor West pointed out that in 1930, 1 out of every 2 Americans is poor.
Right, but you've got a growing population as well.
Right now it's 1 out of 6. Yeah. You've got a growing population. So right now we're in the middle of a recession. Of course, that harms everyone, much like the growing prosperity over the last 50 years has benefited everyone. I mean, a poor person today is much better off than a poor person in 1960. A poor person today has free access to more information than President Reagan had in 1989. Right, thanks to the innovations produced by, say, Google, Facebook, Wikipedia. It's unclear how you should read these numbers, right?
Are you saying the definition of people who are poor has changed?
Yeah, of course. I mean, people are considered poor now who do not, because they can't afford air conditioning. They can't pay their cable bill. Right?
Pick a fight with you because I'm old enough to remember the 1960s, and one of the kinds of things
I'm not, but I'll grant you the advantage.
All right, young man. One of the struggles, for example, in healthcare among poor people in New York City in the 1960s was to get a voice in decision making by the public hospitals. Today, the fight is to keep any public hospitals open. It's gotten worse.
Rocky?
This just seems so twisted to me to compare what's going on now to 100 years ago and try to say that that's somehow a rosy scenario. The fact is, in this country, the poor are not getting health care. Even after Obamacare is fully implemented, there will be 30 million people in this country without essential health care. And what does that translate into? We are next to last among all industrialized nations in terms of survival of newborn babies. We have one of the highest maternal mortality rates.
Yeah, I was looking at the figures here.
The entire industrialized world. In the United States, 16.7 out of 100,000 live births maternal mortality. Women die in connection with those pregnancies. That's compared to 3.9 in Italy, 7 in Germany. And even with that horrendous figure of 16.7 deaths, it's even far worse for African American women. It's 4 times as bad. 36 is the rate in terms of maternal mortality in the United States, 4 times as high as for white women. So this disparity just keeps growing and growing. It's the worst disparity in income and wealth than at any time since before the Depression, and it just keeps getting worse. Between 2005 and 2009, people who were accumulating any wealth in their households, imagine this, among Hispanic households, and this is according to the classifications under the census, among Hispanic households, they lost 66% of their household wealth. In African American households, 53%, and only 16% among white households. White households have 18 times the accumulated wealth as Hispanics and 20 times the accumulated wealth as African Americans. So this is a very serious problem. It's just getting worse, and it's a result of the plutocracy, a government that's run of, by, and for the very wealthy.
You want to respond to that, Stan?
So on the latter point, most of that decrease in household wealth is purely because of the fact that the housing bubble burst, right? Obviously, Hispanic households live overwhelmingly in the states that had the largest bubble. So, of course, they've also lost the most money.
But that didn't just come about naturally. That bubble came about because of massive fraud on Wall Street. And by the way, during that same period of time,
and of course, artificially low interest rates for those households.
720% increase in Wall Street profits between 2007 and 2009, when everybody else ends up suffering in this country. It's a perverse system, the deregulation that led to this disaster by our politicians, both in the White House and in Congress. We need to understand how this is happening and who needs to be held accountable.
Okay, let's look at how this is impacting the current presidential campaigns. Let's take a look at how the candidates are framing the economic debate in their campaign ads. We have 2 ads. Let's take a look.
We're a nation of workers and doers and dreamers. We work hard for what we get. And all we ask for is that our hard work pays off. I believe that the way you grow the economy is from the middle out. I believe in fighting for the middle class, because if they're prospering, all of us will prosper. That's the idea of America, and that's why America's the greatest nation on earth.
Where did all the Obama stimulus money go? Friends, donors, campaign supporters, special interest groups. Where did the Obama stimulus money go? Solyndra, 500 million taxpayer dollars, bankrupt. So where did the Obama stimulus money go? Windmills from China, electric cars from Finland.
79% of the $2.1 billion in stimulus grants awarded through it went to overseas companies.
So 2 ads there from the current campaigns from the 2 candidates running for president there. Barbara, you know, President Obama always talks about the middle class and his interest in the middle class. What about the poor and destitute? Nobody seems to speak for them.
Well, I was just going to point out, nobody mentioned the poor. I mean, and that's been true since the beginning of the 90s, you know, or earlier. Clinton never mentioned the poor. It's always the middle class. Because, let's face it, the poor have been stigmatized in this country. People don't want to say, yes, I'm poor. Although I'm noticing more and more people willing to say that. Because there has been a fear, there have been several misconceptions. One is that poor people are all people of color, they're all minorities. No, the plurality of people in poverty, are white people, and always have been. The other thing is the idea that poverty comes from bad personal habits. You know, why is somebody poor? Well, they must have a bad lifestyle. They must have some bad habits. They must have made some bad decisions. They must, be drug addicts and so promiscuous.
What do you say, Stan?
That's
are people poor because they make bad choices?
I mean, some people are. objectively. Obviously, some people end up poor because they're heroin addicts. Other people are poor because they grow up without opportunities. I mean, it's clear, right? Yes. Both groups are represented. I don't think anyone would deny that.
Right, I'm just saying.
Okay.
I think another reason why people haven't talked much about the poor over the last 4 years is, well, first of all, many people are suffering, and second, the healthcare debate has dominated so much of political discourse, and of course the poor were already covered under Medicaid, right? So they were not super relevant to that discussion.
Wait a minute. Medicaid is not a universal program for the poor. There are so many people who have always been left out of it. If you are a single person with no children and you're not actually disabled, forget about it. I mean, most of the people, the many people in my family, in my extended family, who have no insurance, they can't qualify for Medicaid. Maybe they make a little too much money, or maybe they don't have kids or something. We have no such program.
And that's what's being ignored in all of this discussion is the working poor. People who are one event, perhaps one paycheck away from poverty. And if you include them in this discussion, you're talking about 1 out of 2 people in this country either in poverty or near poverty. 700,000 bankruptcies are filed in the United States every year because of high health care bills. That's not likely to change under Obamacare. People are right on the edge, living every single day with catastrophe around the corner. If there's an accident, if there's a serious illness.
Car breaks down.
Exactly.
Dental emergency.
Well, that was the figure that Cornel West mentioned when he said the poor, or near poor as he called them.
If you make it 3 significant events, I'm sure it's pretty much the entire population, right? But I mean, not to try and
but that's the problem. We don't have those safety nets. These aren't true safety nets in place. And somebody to just cavalierly say, well, the poor are taken care of, like Mitt Romney and like you just indicated.
I didn't try to say that. I was trying to explain why
Mitt Romney did.
I was trying to explain why they haven't been featured that much in the debate because it was about a large other group.
For somebody to say that they don't care about the poor because they have the safety nets.
That was not the best line.
The poor were not always ignored in the United States. Poverty hasn't always been a dirty word in U.S. politics. I mean, take a look at this ad here, which was released by Lyndon Johnson back in 1964. Let's have a look at this.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created anew in each generation, but not by heredity, by circumstances. Today, millions of American families are caught in circumstances beyond their control. Their children will be compelled to live lives of poverty unless the cycle is broken. President Johnson's war on poverty has this one goal: to provide everyone a chance to grow and make his own way. A chance at education, a chance at training, a chance at a fruitful life. For the first time in the history of America, this can be done.
That was way back in the 60s. We don't see ads like that anymore. And where's the war on poverty right now?
Well, right now, the poverty level is greater than it was
at that point
before 1965. And it mattered to people. We were a country that cared about each other. The war on poverty was a war that we were all proud to fight, where we saw leadership in Congress from both parties finding solutions. We saw the Great Society. And during the last election, the word poor or poverty didn't pass the lips of either John McCain or Barack Obama or any of the journalists that were involved. And we don't hear about it this time around either.
Now, obviously, everyone wants poverty to disappear and everyone to be as well off as possible. I think what we disagree on is the methods through which, right? And you could say, for the past 40 years, the key methodologies of the war on poverty, which are transfer programs to a large extent, do not seem to have worked super well, right? I mean, today, as you said, the poverty rate just as high as it was then, maybe a little bit higher. It doesn't make it seem like those effective solutions that both parties in Congress reached in the 60s and 70s have worked.
But Stan, the biggest transfer program, if you want to call it that, is Social Security and Medicare, if you want to call it. And Social Security really pulled America's senior citizens out of poverty. You know, when the cost of living allowance was adjustment was added in the 60s, it just changed the face of poverty. You know, suddenly the geezers had money, or at least could live.
But yeah, that's a
and
good,
we could do that. You know,
that's a good
poverty,
example of why that program. It's a good reason why that program works, right? I mean, old people, retired people, by definition, do not face terrible labor incentives because they are retired, right? They're not going to work no matter how you treat them. The problem is when it's people who are younger, you start giving them money. What incentive do they have to build a future for themselves?
You know, when
I'm just saying it's easier to resolve poverty among very old people than it is among younger people.
Go ahead, Rocky.
But if there are jobs, if there are job training programs, you've got people lined up all over this country ready to work. If you have good education, but what we see, this really is a matter of simple priorities. When you spend as much on military, you used the word defense earlier. I never use that word because there's almost no defense entailed in our military spending. It's aggressive empire building. You reduce that wasteful spending and you start bringing in the revenues so that the wealthy pay their fair share. You get rid of these budget-busting Bush tax cuts for the very wealthy, and we can have good education. We can have great preschool programs for our young people and break the cycle of poverty. I've seen it in my own city, Salt Lake City. I was on the board of Guadalupe schools for 15 years. We took that program into the homes with in-home preschool programs, and these kids were doing exceedingly well.
And so why do those programs not get implemented everywhere? I mean, most U.S. school districts spend more on their educational system per pupil than, say, Finland, right?
I just want to say I would like to see transfer payments, welfare, let's call it that were large enough so that people did not have to take jobs that pay $8 an hour that they can't live on. That's what I'd like. If there was that kind of safety net where you could say, oh no, I'm not working for that.
In a utopian society, you would give everyone enough money and they wouldn't have to work.
This is not utopian. You cannot live on the amount of wages that so many people are trying to make now. 6 people are lining up for every single available job in the first place. I would like to see people able to say, no, I could survive without this dumb job. You know, take this job and stuff it. Wasn't that the song or what?
I think it was shove it, actually.
Oh, shove it. Okay, all right. You know, is that people are being asked to, to break their backs, to age themselves, to get arthritis, to do all these things in the name of job, and to neglect their children often, in the name of jobs that are not going to really put food on the table.
I mean, one reason why those wages are low, of course, is that the U.S. in the last, say, 30 years has incorporated 40 million relatively unskilled immigrants who've taken those jobs, right? Or at least competed with locals. One thing you should give the U.S. economy credit for is that it's now employing those 40 million people, and it's made them at least American-style poor instead of Mexican-style poor, which is a huge step up. Naturally, that drives down wages for local unskilled workers.
Well, you're helping make the case for raising the minimum wage to at least $10 an hour. Because if you apply inflation, the impact of inflation since 1965, the minimum wage to keep pace would be $10.35 an hour.
How did I make the case for that?
We absolutely need to raise the minimum wage, because you were talking about those forces
because you want to reduce,
under your theory, drive down wages. We need to have a higher minimum wage, at least $10 an hour, to keep pace with what we haven't seen since 1965.
Note that under my theory, raising the minimum wage will not drive up wages. It will just eliminate jobs.
Oh, well, empirically, you're not on a very sound basis with that.
There's a lot of debate about that.
But there are plenty of studies that show that, like when the state of Washington got up to, what are they now? They were one of the high ones. Yep. It did not mean that they lost jobs to, what is the neighboring state, Idaho, which has is a very low minimum wage. It wasn't. In fact, business grew on the other side because people were coming over there to work and spend their money too.
Because people will have the money then to go spend and help build our economy.
So why wouldn't you raise the minimum wage to $50 an hour?
Okay, we are going to have to leave it right there. Interesting discussion, lots more to talk about, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thanks to all of you. That's it for our television viewers. We'll have an extended show on the web. If you want to see more of this program, log on to aljazeera.com. And we continue the discussion here for our viewers on the web. Stan, when we look at poverty figures, are they a little bit distorted because things like food stamps
are not counted
as income, subsidies for housing not counted as income, subsidies for health insurance not counted as income?
Yeah, so one thing you see in the data on poor people is that the inequality in income is much larger than that in actual consumption. So for example, over the last decade, you see that incomes have been basically flat for working class, poor Americans. But at the same time, the percentage of the poor in the US that had air conditioning, for example, doubled. And to some extent, that speaks to how well the safety net works. Right, that even in these terrible times, people, and even though their incomes aren't progressing, they still get to enjoy more of the sort of good things that society has produced. About half of them have computers now, internet access. You're definitely right when you say that those poverty estimates are overstated.
Well, but I do want to say that there is an idea that poverty in America is pretty comfortable compared to poverty in other parts of the world.
Which is true to some extent.
But I think
I'm sure there's poverty in Uganda.
A
lot worse.
But the thing you have to
being
reckon
a middle-class woman in Saudi Arabia, not cool. You can't drive.
60%. No, of course.
No, I'm just saying.
60% of. There's been a 60% increase in the last few years since the recession started in the number of people who count as extremely poor. That is under, half that poverty level you're talking about.
So how is the $50 minimum wage going to solve that?
I've worked alongside people who were homeless. This is when I was working in low-wage jobs as an undercover journalist.
That's 4% of the
We're
poor.
Living in your vehicle, not being able to have health insurance, dying as some people have because you can't get a tooth pulled, an abscess tooth. These are world-class levels of poverty. The member of my extended family who lived in a single-wide trailer for years with her daughter and 2 grandchildren, and the trailer had holes in it, that's world-class.
And I understand that that's terrible. And I agree with you on that. I think what we disagree on is how to make that disappear. Right? I mean, your plan is $50 minimum wage.
No, you said the 50. You offered 50.
Yeah, you said, yeah, I'll take it.
No, I know, but we were going to start with 10, right? We were going to.
Rocky said 10.
Be reasonable.
That's still not a living wage.
No.
And you are so off point.
No, but given that the minimum wage
scenario, you go walk in the shoes of those 20 million people that are making half or less of the poverty rate.
I understand
in
that
this country.
I understand
there
that.
are people going to bed, children going to bed hungry. 22%.
And it's bad, but it's not obvious what the solution is.
Living in poverty, and it's getting worse. And this disparity between this elite class in this country, the very wealthy. I mean, the Joe Cassano, with AIG, who helped start the ball rolling. He was after this an enormous infusion of taxpayer money into AIG. They let him go and paid him $1 million a month. It is absolutely shameful that those people in Congress and in the White House who are supposed to be protecting our interests and helping us all look out for our brothers and sisters who are suffering so horrendously, it is unbelievable to me that we can't rise to a higher level in this country.
Well, let's look at some of the poverty demographics. I mean, poverty across several demographics is already higher than the national average. 22% of children live in poverty. Poverty among African Americans and Latinos is 27%, and an incredible 42% of single women with children, almost half.
So you're saying there's also groups that are below the national average, because that's what you get with an average, right?
Right.
Okay.
For almost half live in poverty.
But there are those racial implications
Yes.
that should not be ignored. And that's, I think, the point, is that we can do so much better and not continue this pattern. The war on poverty made so much progress, and it was because of a national will to do something about it. It seems that we've lost that will. A Mitt Romney who says he doesn't care about the poor because they've got a sufficient safety net. A president of the United States who has done almost nothing, and then he throws out a few crumbs during his campaign, and everybody goes, oh, isn't that great? Now he's not going to deport people after he's deported more people, in fact, twice as many people as were deported during the first term of George W. Bush. So we cannot be suckered into this anymore. These campaign promises, these slogans, ask, what has a person done? And if they haven't done anything, don't give them your support. Send the message that we're going to insist that things get better in this country. And for all of us, imagine the power that 1 out of 2 people who are living at or near poverty, the power that they can have if they'll just go out and register and vote and become politically active. They can turn the course in this country, and the rest of us need to get on board and show that kind of caring compassion.
The politicians know that they're not going to go out and vote, and that's working
Well, and
against
some of them may agree with certain politicians on policies to be followed. Some of them may not agree with your plan to raise the minimum wage to $20 an hour because they worry that it'll destroy employment.
Well, I didn't say $20 an hour either.
It was higher than that.
The minimum wage isn't going to take care of poverty. It's not going to provide a living wage. You know, we've got to stop the outsourcing of jobs. We haven't talked about that. Why do we not have those millions of good-paying jobs in this country anymore? It's primarily because of the neoliberals. It was under the Clinton administration with the Republicans aiding and abetting them. These free trade agreements that need to be renegotiated so we have fair trade and we bring those jobs back to this country, and we need to reprioritize. No more of this crazy spending on the military. No more of these outrageous, aggressive wars that have
Obviously,
wasted our national
free trade
treasure.
has massive advantages too, right? First of all, to U.S. consumers who get to consume better, cheaper goods. Clothing, for example,
Well,
a lot
what
cheaper than
costs?
it
You're
would
not
be if
talking
it were produced.
What about the
We're not produced in
externalities?
China.
And so we
Hundreds
end
and
up-
hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indians who've been lifted out of poverty over the last
let's look at
40
this,
years.
Stan. Have things like, things that Rocky mentioned, globalization, outsourcing, lack of unions, lack of, union powers gone down in this country. They must have an impact on poverty levels in this country.
Direct correlation between the lower union membership and lower wages. And it's not just for union members. When you have strong unions, there's a rippling effect to the higher wages. That was in large part is how we built a strong, thriving, sustained middle class for 35 years. And
So
then it's all turned around and we're back to the Gilded Age.
I agree that there's a direct correlation, but it goes the other way around. And I would think that outsourcing, free trade, and maybe a reduction in union power will probably make all Americans better off in the long run.
Do you agree, Barbara?
Whoa. Well, I think I am in some sense myself a union success story. My father was a miner in Butte, Montana, and the miners had their own union, not affiliated with anything national, the Butte Miners Union, and it brought us up. It made it possible for us for someone like me to eventually think of going to college. I mean, that's our strength. That was like a religious thing I was raised with. That when people stick together, they can pull themselves up together.
Do you think,
the union
do you think that
is
say
about solidarity.
Do you think that, say, public teaching unions have helped poor children over the last 30 years?
Insofar as they have gotten better working conditions and salaries for teachers, yes.
So the teachers' children,
if we're
yes.
going to disrespect, no, the kids in the class. If we're going to disrespect our teachers and we're going to start driving them down further and further in pay and everything, well, that's going to hurt the kids.
Okay, Rocky, we have a minute left. Just one other thing I want to bring up, and that is, given that the economy is on very rough ground, I mean, as we mentioned, the latest figures that just came out on growth, 1.5%. Very lukewarm growth, very tepid. We can expect this situation to get worse.
It is going to get worse, especially when we have the budget problems we have with the giveaways to the very wealthy, this massive reprioritization that we require in this country for people to have a decent break so that the very wealthy aren't just reaping in all of the benefits. I mean, we've seen huge increases in productivity due to working men and women, and yet their wages have remained stagnant, when the 1% are making out like bandits with 42% of the wealth.
Okay, that's where we're going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. That is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. Thanks for joining us.